I'm going to show you something remarkable. And I'm going to show you this so you can see how far your government has fallen. You have 44 or 40 million people out of a job currently. You have 120,000 people that are dead. You have over 2 million people that are infected with COVID-19. You have roughly 30 million people who are out of health insurance. And again, this is in the middle of a healthcare crisis. Next month, payments that are going to people, the extra bump that they were getting in their unemployment stops. In addition to that, the meager rent controls that were put into place end. When unemployment was 4.9%, 3 point something million, let's say 4 million people were being evicted during that year. We're at 20%. Do you know what they were quibbling about in Washington, D.C.? They were concerned because of the disincentive to work. What does that mean? There are some people who was making so meager of a wage, they were making minimum wage, and the extra bump of those $600 was more than that they were getting from their regular pay. So because they were getting paid so little, meaning $7.20, like less than $18,000 a year, I think it ended up being $13,000 a year, they didn't want to give them the extra $200. Do you know how fucked up that is? Like, people have literally lost their jobs. They are utterly broke. And their only thing they can think of is we need to force people back to work, in some cases, in hazardous conditions, by cutting away the money that they were getting in order to live. So if they are hungry, if they need health care, if they need a house, if they need light bill, then they will take their ass back to work, even if that means they'll die on the job. That's what our government is doing. Mind-blowing, right? 88% of your public says they want Medicare for all. Of Democrats, 70% of everyone else. Medicare for all has been fought for over a year with 20 Democrats, spineless, shivering Democrats, taking their shots at it. And it came out higher than what it was when it started. The public knows what it wants. The Democratic Party says, Cobra. Nobody that has ever used Cobra likes Cobra. Cobra doesn't even make any sense. You lose your job. Let's say you're one of those people that's making $13,000 a year. You have no savings in the bank. You lose your job, and they say you can get Cobra, and you could pay us $500 a month. But I don't have a job. How am I going to pay you $500 a month? That's not our issue. Cobra. Performative trash. Posing as a solution to your issues of not having health care. This is our society. Your governmental device has literally lost all tether to the public itself. You understand that part and parcel to the reason that it's lost all tether to the public is because, from the standpoint of Democrats, you've accepted blue no matter who. And accepting blue no matter who, you've basically removed all accountability from your political process. So as money got dumped into the politics, the Democratic Party flew fast and furious to the right in accepting gobs and gobs of cash in their gullet, while simultaneously telling you, we're least worst. We're the pragmatic choice. You got to vote for us. The Supreme Court, or this or that. Missing the point that narrow focused pragmatism doesn't look all that pragmatic at all when you look at it over the course of time and you realize policy or politics has a momentum to it, and the momentum has been decidedly to the right. There is nothing within the context of a Democrat that is objective, and that should bother you. If I say I am for Medicare for all, that's what I'm for. If I say I am for Social Security, that's what I'm for. If I need to bleed and die on the flag, I will do so holding on and fighting for those items. That is something that is objective to me in this case. There's nothing like that for Democrats. They were willing to cut Social Security. Bill Clinton was willing to privatize Social Security. So what of this? No. You have a situation where a political party basically realized that people were so terrified. Blacks were so terrified of Republicans. Hispanics were so terrified of Republicans. Lefties could be cowed into this nonsense of you have nowhere else to go. In which case, the Democrat doesn't really have to do anything, just be least worse. And he could focus on this notion of incrementalism. The wild part about this is so many people have pulled out of the political space, and those people are predominantly Democratic voters. The least worst thing, people stop being engaged in the political process because those people realized that the energy they put into the political process was not being pushed back in regards to real material concerns, things that will deal with their material needs. You also had that side effect that because incrementalism is the plan of the day, is the best that the Democratic Party can do, that when they saw Sanders, they thought it was impossible for him to get elected, despite the fact that he won all the policy arguments. All I'm saying is there is something fundamentally wrong with your government. Under normal circumstances, a rational government would have taken expansive action in order to deal with this particular crisis. They would have ensured that each person, or they would have basically nationalized everything to some degree, but basically making sure that the people will remain whole, people were getting their paycheck, maybe 80% of their paychecks. There were rational actions that could be taken, ensuring that it wasn't that bad when it came over here because we were prepared, because we had 3-month lead time, and the World Health Organization, we had people in there that can hear from China. You had the capacity to do something. We just didn't. I'm trying to point out to you that a rational government doesn't behave this way. There's something fundamentally wrong with this Frankenstein government where the public, it's supposed to provide for the general welfare, and it's telling the public to kick rocks. You have millions of people on the street right now screaming, defund the cops. What did Trump say? I'm going to increase funding for the cops. In fact, he gave performative nonsense, basically a nothing. He took a dump in a jar and threw it into the audience. That's how much he thought of what the Black Lives Matter protesters. He knows he's not getting any of the black vote. His issue is that the public is against him on this. The public doesn't think he did a good job on it. The public doesn't think he did a job on COVID-19. So he has to answer that. So he answered with basically a bunch of words that don't mean anything. It don't mean anything. And the Democratic Party, no better. Kente cloth. Shocking, Nancy Pelosi can take a knee and get back up. Best they got. Even when they put out that performative trash bill that had no chance of getting passed, this was supposed to be the Democratic values. What did they have in it? Cobra. I'm making the point that in the middle of a crisis, literally, the best that they could do is basically nothing. Not even trying. Not even pretending. That should concern you. Why doesn't that concern people? At the exact same time, your government decided to attack Iran and pull away from the nuclear agreement. The interesting thing about this is that the world, all of these countries that were supposed to be part of this agreement and that was supposed to keep everybody in check, when the United States pulled out, all of those countries shut the fuck up. Those countries didn't have anything to say. But I bet you if Iran did it, they would have flipped out. When Iran said, we're going to incrementally up our the amount that we're going to raise. Because fact of the matter is, the United States shot that deal in the face. Iran was still doing politics and trying to still work within the context of the deal so they can try to salvage the deal. They were the rational actors in this process. The rest of the countries didn't do a goddamn thing. They turned a blind eye to exactly what the United States was doing, basically patsy nations, meaning the deal was worthless because those countries wasn't going to do what was necessary, A, to protect Iran, and B, to cow the United States once the United States basically went belligerent. The United States is in the middle of a healthcare crisis. We're in the middle of a housing crisis. We're in the middle of a job crisis. And despite all of these other issues that avail us, Donald Trump finds time to fuck over Syria. And he does it in one of the most disgusting ways that gets across the level of mendacity and utter depravity that is associated with not just Trump, but the country itself. Because there had people who had to follow that particular order and going out there and do a job. And they think, hey, I'm doing what's great for America. No, you're not. Starving another nation is not great for America. That's not great for anybody. That's utterly fucking disgusting. And yeah, that's a war crime, by the way, just so you wanted to know. You're not necessarily supposed to carry out an order that's an illegal order. But again, the illegality has something to do with the United States. And if the president gives you the order, it doesn't matter what the international community says. I have argued on more than one occasion that there is no such thing as international law. If a country or multiple countries can flagrantly violate whatever that law is, then that's not a real law. That's basically selective justice that you use for podunk dictators in Africa, where you can actually try to find some legitimacy for your experience. But fact of the matter is, George Bush was responsible for the death of 1 million people, and the ICC doesn't do a goddamn thing about it, including from the standpoint of the war crimes that was taking place in Afghanistan, because despite the United States not being a signatory, Afghanistan is. And we, shining city on the hill, freedom and justice, turned around and attacked the International Criminal Court. There is something fundamentally wrong with your country. Obama called Venezuela a a threat. No reporter raised their hand and said how. None, not one. Venezuela wasn't a threat. We decided to do that. I would wager to you that there were oil reserves that was in Venezuela that the United States and companies working with the United States wanted to get their hands on, and Obama was their conduit to do so. Obama raised $1 billion in that race, and if you raise $1 billion and the only thing you had to do was fuck over another nation that you have no access to, you don't necessarily know anybody there for, and you can basically lie, you have a whole media apparatus that can demonize the country, would you do it? Obama would, yeah. This country has taken an action that is sadistic at its core, and that is literally, in real terms, a war crime, and is being done so in the middle of a pandemic to make it that much worse. When Saudi Arabia decided to use starvation as a weapon, basically weaponizing people's inability to get access to food and nutrients that they need to survive, we thought that was utterly disgusting and sadistic. But Saudi Arabia is a totalitarian regime full of religious maniacs and zealots. Here's the thing, though. Capitalism is also just a religion. And whether or not... Yeah, capitalism is also just a religion. And in this very specific case, this is not a capitalistic thing. This is more of a geopolitical thing. But it's geopolitics at a level that is utterly depraved. If you were looking for a reason to impeach Donald Trump, this would have been it. But they chose to do that stupid shit from the Ukraine that wasn't a real thing and that Joe Biden himself has been caught doing. Welcome to the Soapbox. My name is Jamal Thomas. This is the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, if you dig this content, please like, share, and subscribe. You can always support this content, PayPal or Patreon. This video went longer than I wanted. I mean, I'm aggravated. And because I'm aggravated, I'm bitching. And so I'm just going to have to cut the video. Look at this. Do you remember this? This is Donald Trump. ISIS is supposed to be under lock and key. But listen to what he says about Obama.
Obama's ill-fated push at regime change, U.S. troops are still on the ground in Syria. More than 500,000 people are dead, hundreds of thousands are terribly injured, and millions more Syrians are displaced. It really is a nightmare of misery. Across the Middle East, we have seen anguish on a colossal scale. We have spent $8 trillion on wars in the Middle East, never really wanting to win those wars. But after all that money was spent and all those lives lost, the young men and women gravely wounded so many, the Middle East is less safe, less stable, and less secure.
Now, everything he said there was true. Every last word he said there was true. And understand what he said. The previous president of the United States lied to the American public and worked to try regime change in Syria, despite the fact that he said that's not what he was doing. Obama was using the CIA and in other cases the military, or let's say terrorists backed by the CIA and terrorists backed by the military. We called them rebels. We were perfectly okay with the Turkish fighters when they were basically working as a mercenary force for us, or proxy force for us. On top of that, there were instances where rebels backed by the CIA were fighting rebels backed by the military. Yeah, it was that cartoonish. To make this more, to put a finer point on it, behind the sudden death of a $1 billion secret CIA war, I want the way, listen to the New York Times, the way they say this. The shuttering of the CIA program, one of the most expensive efforts to arm and train rebels once the agency's program arming the Mujahideen in Afghanistan during the 1980s, has forced a reckoning over its successes and failures. Opponents say that it was foolhardy, expensive, and ineffective. Supporters say it was. Now, they call them rebels. But who are the rebels fighting? Right here. The program did have periods of success, including 2015 when rebels using tank-destroying missiles supplied by CIA and Saudis routed government forces in northern Syria. So wait, the rebels that Obama was training wasn't fighting ISIS? They were fighting the government of Syria? Yes, they were. Because part and parcel to what they were trying to do was topple the government of Assad. Remember, Assad has to go. Who the fuck are you to say that anybody has to go? That's a sovereign nation. Mind-blowing. And nobody asked the question like, whoa, how is he telling him somebody else from another nation that person has to go? It gets worse. Right here. Obama put a reign of terror like nobody's business. 500,000 lives extinguished because he wanted to play geopolitics. Here's the other one. Saudi Arabia wanted to invade and get into a war with Yemen. They used the fig leaf of, hey, Iran is part of it. Right here. Saudi Arabia and the Persian Gulf neighbors were poised to begin a campaign in support of Yemen's impotent government. An offensive, Mr. Jabir said, could be relatively swift. Obama did not believe it was going to be relatively swift. And yet, Obama soon gave his approval to the Pentagon to support the impending military campaigns. And of course, this was another issue where Saudi Arabia was indiscriminately bombing and killing civilians, seemingly not caring whether or not the person was a civilian or whether the person was whoever they were trying to fight. And on top of that, the United States was helping them do that. Do you think sometimes you're on the wrong side? Do you? I mean, if you think of the Western governments and everything else in a way that they're just patsy nations, and there's not a fairness in regards to the way that we deal with the other nations, even though we pretend that there's some level of a fairness. In the media, we pretend that there's some level of fairness to just gaslight. It's the most bizarre thing in the world when you just sit there and watch it, especially if you've been to other countries and you can look at it from outside of itself. And you get back in and you're like, these guys are, what the fuck are they talking about? Here's another one, right here. Obama secretly funneling money to the rebels in Libya. Then he turns around once the rebels are engaging Gaddafi and says, we need to protect the population. We need humanitarian bombs. You know, the bombs that only hit bad people. And when it hit a good person, it turns into a rose. That's what we need. Do you realize in some of the bombing campaigns in Iraq, 90% of the people that were hit were innocent? At that point, you're not even hitting terrorists anymore. You're just hitting civilians. They make the point that, oh, golly gee, weapons ended up in the hands of the terrorists. Yes, maybe it's not a coincidence. Maybe it's not a coincidence at all. Maybe it's not a coincidence. Now, we've established that Obama did indeed try to topple the Syrian government. That Obama invaded under false pretenses, and CIA and the military were funneling money to terrorists in pursuit of toppling that government. Head choppers, thick beards, thick necks, in working at the behest of the US government, chopping off heads and raping women. They're our monsters. Now, despite Donald Trump admitting that, yes, we went there to get rid of Assad, we lied to the American public, we killed, or we were responsible, in part culpable, for 500,000 deaths extinguished. Do you understand how fucked up that is? You had people in Syria, whatever you want to think of the government, but people who were making a life, doctors, lawyers, people who worked in all sorts of businesses and stores and everything else. And we instigated war. Do you believe that somehow the person who was a doctor or who was, let's say, a store clerk over there is somehow different from you? And that they had a life, whatever you want to think of that life, in the same way that you had a life, in the way that they would think of your life. I'm trying to get across to you the level of fucked up it is to be so willing to extinguish a life, and not just extinguish life, 500,000 of them, and not care one iota. Donald Trump has just implicated the last president in war crimes. Despite the fact that Donald Trump has implicated the last president in war crimes in Syria, Donald Trump still comes out and says this.
President Erdogan wants to come to the White House. We have a very good relationship. The ceasefire has held very nicely. We've kept the oil. We stayed back and kept the oil. Other people can patrol the border of Syria, frankly, and Turkey. Let them. They've been fighting for 1,000 years. Let them do the border. We don't want to do that. We want to bring our soldiers home. But we did leave soldiers because we're keeping the oil. I like oil. We're keeping the oil, and we're working.
Now, just so we're clear, the last president of the United States invades Syria under false pretenses. In pursuit of invading them, gives billions of dollars to terrorists, thick necks, long beards, head choppers, rapists, in order to topple the Syrian government and to remove Bashar al-Assad. Despite you admitting to that, you still turn around and say, yes, we invaded under false pretenses. Yes, we were responsible for the deaths of 500,000 people in that country. However, we're going to steal the oil. Now, Syria doesn't have a huge amount of oil. This is not like Saudi Arabia. The amount of oil that they have is basically for internal consumption. So him stealing the oil like this is basically robbing and draining them of resources. On top of stealing the oil, he's made the decision to destroy wheat fields. Now, Syria is already at the brink of starvation because of COVID-19. Donald Trump has ordered this. Hundreds of acres destroyed. People who already had nothing, and you took that much more. Process that. Like, honestly, process that in real terms. I'll leave it here. I'm bothered by this greatly. I mean, it's a level of depravity that's associated with it, like just mean spirit depravity that goes into this notion that you're willing to starve people to death in pursuit of what? In pursuit of what? What are you trying to accomplish? And you're starving people to death. You've stolen oil. Again, the theft of the oil is also to drain them of resources. You've burned their wheat fields. You didn't even accumulate it, meaning you didn't even want it. You just didn't want them to have it. In which case you were that much more willing, meaning to drop thermal balloons, destroy their wheat fields. That's a mind-blowing thing. None of the other countries of Europe will say anything. None of them opened their mouth over this stuff. And yet they would bitch and moan the moment that Iran said, okay, we're going to increment. I was like, how dare you increment your uranium by 1 iota? That doesn't mean a goddamn thing. It's just a political number in order for us to fuck with you on. All of those countries shut the fuck up and let this happen. And they didn't say anything. We don't like Syria, and so the fact that they're going to be starved to death is perfectly fair game. Why is that fair game? Explain to me, why is that fair game? You don't like Assad, okay. What does that have to do with the people going hungry? What is your goal? Starve the people to death so they get rid of Assad? But let's just be clear. Your objective is to starve people to death. Massively fucked up. Massively fucked up. Marcus Will. Well, we're in Syria for Israel, Trump 2018. In part, yeah. In part, Golan Heights, yeah. And, you know, this appropriation of land. And you know what made this so bad? Israel was actually working with terrorists in order to create a buffer zone. And I know this sounds weird, but the money, Israel, the United States, the money that they were giving to these guys, basically they were using that as a battering ram to knock down Syria and create a buffer zone between Syria and Israel. Not to mention, from the standpoint of Golan Heights, making it that much more to reacquire their territory back. Because, again, Israel, king stealer of land, stole the Golan Heights. We are on the wrong side. I don't know how else to say it. It's not so much that all of these other countries are angels. It's just some of this stuff is just so sadistic. Like the sanctions that were put on Venezuela murdered people. You understand, sanctions are an act of war. We were putting sanctions on Iran at the exact same time that Iran was having all of these floods and whatnot. We didn't give a shit about what was going on over there. And the majority of the public didn't even know about it. It was either floods or earthquakes. I think it was floods. It's just a level of harshness that we engage the world in. And that's also in the United States. I mean, we have 25% of the world's population at prison. I mean, for fuck's sake, You have 40 million people out of a job and your government ain't care one iota. They gave a pittance of $1,200 and expected that $1,200 to last for months. Like, understand the situation to which you're presented with, how off this is. We must get some level of control over our governmental device. Otherwise, this is just going to get worse. And all of those millions of people in the streets are doing God's work. And the fact that the American public agrees with them to some degree gets across that the American public gets it at some level that something's fundamentally wrong. And the problem is that that's not Trump in and of itself. Trump is just a symptom of the thing that is wrong in that situation. This goes deeper than that. When you look at the outcomes from the standpoint of poverty, the outcomes are utterly horrendous. And we're shocked as shit that we have all sorts of problems in our society. You realize brain matter, lead water, that we have kids and that we have people drinking around the communities. We know the communities that are left in disrepute have issues of crime, have issues of violence, have issues of drug use, have issues of suicide. And yet we accept that. I'll end this here because I'm going to start bitching. Like, share,